Thank you for the invitation. I am both honored and happy to be here. I have to say that the amphibia character of my personality that Conferinţa so kindly referred to is indeed my both a boon and a bane. It's a predicament in which I'm forced to live, serving two masters, as it were. But the main difference can be summed up in the following. In journalism, scholarship, criticism on the one hand and poetry on the other have something in common, is of course the pursuit of truth. But journalism, criticism, scholarship pursues the truth according to its own norms and standards, and likewise it mobilizes, it activates our cognitive capacities. By far the most important aspect in scholarship, criticism, and journalism is really a cognitive aspect, whereas literature, on the other hand, literature, to my mind, the mind of modern man, the mind of 20th century man, believes that literature is a simultaneous pursuit, is a pursuit that simultaneously mobilizes the totality of being, just as the experience that literature both produces and presents is that of a full-blooded, total and comprehensive human condition, even though it may appear in fragments. But the very idea of the ultima thule, the horizon of expectations and ambitions that literature harbors and is indeed driven by, that is the full-blooded experience that cannot be reduced to a cognitive level. And it is my belief, that literature surpasses criticism and scholarship precisely because it addresses itself to the totality of human condition. In that regard, I have to say that I prefer, in those hours that pass for my spare time, I prefer to feed on literature rather than on criticism. I understand that it is, in many ways, for general educated person, it is easier to read so-called non-fiction, to amass data, facts, narratives that are clearly distinguished from one from another, and so on. But literature, if we allow, let me rephrase this, but literature, if we respond to its siren's call and we allow ourselves to be drawn into its magic circle, then literature can do something that no scholarship can do. And literature provides us with that irresistible pull into a different chronological frame. Literature, if it is a full-blooded, authentic voice, then it punches us in the stomach, it grabs us for the throat, it brings us into its own vortex that we, for the duration of reading, give up or bracket the capacities with which we evaluate everyday reality. So we essentially need to submit to the force of literature that, as I said, brings us into the vortex of human condition, pushing us away, or rather, making us transcend the limitations of time and space. And in that regard, leafing through the books, and in that, for that aspect, I am a modern man, a man of 20th century, because if I were a man of 21st century, then I wouldn't be leafing through the books, but would be gazing at the screen, of a variety of screens. So leafing through the books and plunging into the open oceans of burbling human experience that are contained in small volumes of literature, poetry, fiction. I do not drink and drive. I prefer to smoke and fly. And on the open pages of a book, I fly like on a magic carpet, if you will, if you pardon my trite metaphor, on the open pages of the book, then I fly into the number of the cities and locales that I've never visited, or I have visited only once, but it is the irresistible pool of literature that takes me to the variety of towns that in my mind represent the sort of imaginary map of the world. And because with the hint of shame, I admit my Eurocentrism, I would then map the world as, or the world of Europe through the books that conjure up the cities as the ultimate locale within which the pursuit of freedom is possible. Indeed, there is this old medieval tradition in which the urban air sets one free, which is another word, it's another way of saying that the city, with its multiple identities, invites the incomers, the immigrants, those potential dwellers behind the city walls, to give up their primordial identities, to resign their one and tried and true identity that often comes from a small community. By entering the city, one is both willing and expected to mingle with the others, to learn the rules of cohabitation and the habits of the communal heart, which beat with the, as I said, in a tempo of freedom, setting one free by requiring that one is able to put oneself in the shoes of the other. And that's what literature does. It invites us to open ourselves to the empathy. I think that the empathy, the ability to step in the shoes of the others, to see, if for a blink of an eye, the world through the lens of the other, through the eyes of the other, this is, to my mind, the best way to reduce the prejudices and limit the power that stereotypes have over us. If empathy is the first condition for that erotic relationship between the reader and the writer, between the reader and the book, then I think that we do well to read more literature as the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of the other is today possibly the most pressing need for each and every European citizen of this grand experiment that is today called European Union. And I believe that in facilitating the various formats whereby one can cross the borders without leaving one's home, that is, facilitating a translation of books from the languages we haven't learned and are being unable to read. This is of prime importance because in my experience, one book of fiction based on true events or not, but one book of fiction told me more about the inconceivable suffering that, say, Sarajevo, the Bosnian city in the 1990s, suffered under the longest lasting siege in modern history, siege of the city in modern history. And one book of fiction told me more about the duress, about the pressures and about the predicament that Sarajevans were exposed to during this long-lasting siege. It told me more than the whole slew of books haphazardly put together by well-meaning but often not sophisticated sophisticated enough journalists, not sophisticated in terms of not knowing the facts, but not sophisticated in a sense that literature can be sophisticated. That is, that it offers not only an information, but the experience itself, that it transcends the cognitive aspect. So in that regard, literature really is a window onto a human experience. And it is the human experience that calls for, as I said, the reduction of prejudices if we are to really learn what does it mean to look like the other or to be the other. In fact, I would dare say that literature, its full-blooded accomplishments, is capable of an ongoing play between one and the other, where all the cities become one and one city becomes all the cities. So this utopian pursuit guides me in my readings of books that talk about the places I've never visited. This idea of being able to get under the skin of a different city simply by reading the books about the city. This is something that I had come to not only appreciate but positively cherish. And it is for somebody like myself who I come from Slovenia, land of one of the lands in former Yugoslavia, always located in terms of physical geography on the cusp between what was until yesterday known as Central Europe on the one hand and the Balkans on the other, being able to reach into the stock of metaphors and narratives of more than one concentric circle of meaning. I had been socialized in the Yugoslav times, and for the last 20 years, odd years, I've been living in independent Slovenia, that since 2004 as an eager member of European Union. But even if European Union didn't exist, what would still exist would be the concentric circles of identity, whereby I did not reach, and I do not reach into the stock of meaning provided by the ethnic Slovenian tradition alone. I had been socialized, and much to my benefit, socialized in the land in which the variety of nationalities, ethnicities, confessions and languages coexisted for better or worse. We did find out that a considerable number of people disliked that sort of cultural mosaic in the 1980s, the latter part of the 1980s, before the breakup of Yugoslavia, where in the absence of a unifying vision for the entire Yugoslav country, the elites, and then followed by the population at large, have resorted to the nationalist impetus. Nationalist impetus, of course, is the impetus of exclusion. It is the driving force of nationalism is its ability to do what no other grand narrative that gives meaning to collective life has succeeded in doing, and that is nationalism naturalizes history. It turns what was man-made and what was historically contingent, turns it into a fact of nature. And in that regard, nationalism is a very successful narrative because it simply divides the world into us and them. I refuse to kowtow to the pressures of this sort of exclusivism, and as I said, I retreat into the open pages of the book that carries me into a variety of ports, including Trieste, when I live through the pages of Duino elegies written by Rainer Maria Rilke. I cannot not but smell the Adriatic the waves of the Adriatic Sea that break against the steep cliffs of the karst that tower over the northern Adriatic Gulf of Trieste, perched upon which is the castle of Duino, in which Rilke wrote two of the famous Duino elegies. And if I don't need to go very far to see the reverberation of that sort of romantic infinity that Rilke attempted to pack into his elegies while lamenting the inability to really do so. That romantic infinity pops up, if fleetingly, in the works of Boris Pahor, the most senior and possibly currently the best living Slovenian author of fiction, who comes from Trieste himself and who calls it City in the Gulf, in which the steamers only blow horns to her, to the imaginary her, to the one that makes life meaningful, bearable. And from the pages of Boris Pahor, Slovenian Triestine author, I immediately enter the pages of a book by another Slovenian author, Marija Tomšič, who wrote about a particular segment of a rural population, that is the peasant women from the high plateau of Kars that towers over Trieste, as I said, who regularly used to descend down the steep hills to the preeminent Habsburgian port town of Trieste to sell the produce, to sell fresh produce, speaking in their own dialect, and they themselves were called Šavrilke. I imagine that I understand the dialect, even though I don't. Yet it is the ability of the writer that to provide a full-blooded experience that I suddenly become as a reader. I become a Šavrilka. I become one of the working women who descend down the hills to sell produce in the port. And just as I had become a Šavrilka, I only need another book to become somebody and utterly else. I become a nameless refugee, and I become an anonymous immigrant that wanders the streets of and boulevards of cities large and small, and that includes Vilnius or Vilna, the city of ashes in the Baltic Sea, up in the north, Lithuania. And it was long before I had set my own foot in Vilnius or Vilna that I had imagined. I understand its rhythm simply by having read the works of Czesław Miłosz, Thomas Venclova, and Eugeniusz Alishanka, who, to one degree or another, all focused on this city of ashes, as Vilna is also known. And my experience of Vilnius comes then filtered through the number of books I had read and lived through, just as my imaginary Lisbon is invariably filtered through the pages of various homonyms that Pessoa used to express his multiple personality and of course multiple abilities to conjure up the world, particular world that not only feeds on the saudade, on the sort of local version of what is known across the world as melancholy, but it also intimates the dilapidated grandeur of the colonial past, as well as the present replete with poverty, but also with fantastic trips across what is possible, across the limitations and the borders of what is possible. And just as I had become a Lisbon dweller through the works of Pessoa, so too I had become a dweller of Zagreb, the capital of the Croatian, capital of Croatia, knowing full well what does it mean to be unsure about your own collective identity, very much as Zagreb and the writers that wrote eloquently about Zagreb have pointed out, including Miroslav Krleža, the preeminent bard, the preeminent 20th century writer in Croatian canon, who once ironically pointed out that the Balkans, that is the repository of all that is bad and negative, begins on the southern side of the most illustrious hotel in Zagreb, that is Hotel Esplanade. But I refuse, as I said, to kowtow to exclusivisms and stereotypes, and so too I refuse to accept this neat division between the good Western Europe and the bad Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And the Balkans, of course, capitalized on both negativities. It is in the south as well as in the east of Europe. So it has two sources of negative prejudice directed against it. Yet I know that the Balkans is more than just a place where the trains run late and where the restaurants do not necessarily serve the paper towel or provided with paper tissues. I know that the Balkans is also the place not of only the barbaric genius of one Ljubomir Micic, the avant-garde writer, founder of Zenetism, as it was called, the avant-garde movement between the two world wars on the axis Zagreb-Belgrade. Barbaric genius is an interesting, albeit ultimately unsatisfactory term for what Ljubomir Micic and his acolytes believed was necessary at the time in the period in the wake of the First World War. Like many other avant-garde writers and artists, they believed that the pre-stabilized harmony of the bourgeois class and attendant morals was largely responsible for the First World War carnage. Hence, Europe was seen as weak and corrupt, and it needed the unfettered energies and unbound virility of a Balkan man, for they were men, of a Balkan man that will squirt large dose of new blood into decrepit Europe. That sort of barbaric genius that turned upside down the existing stereotype, that is, the Western Europe is good and the East and the Balkans is bad, turning it upside down and elevating the Balkans to the standard and to the life-defining norm, only to end up in racism and anti-Semitism. No, it is not just Ljubomir Micic whose works I glimpse. It is the work of Danilo Kiš and David Al-Bahari, the Serbian writers, who both have written eloquently and indeed movingly with the lyrical precision, as well as with the trembling cadence of a lament, writing about what does it mean to live among those that are not like you, what does it mean to constantly negotiate the fragile bridges between the various communities, and what does it mean and how do we benefit from being exposed to the variety of voices. I refuse to see the Balkans as the repository of bad ideas. I refuse to see the Balkans as the dumping grounds for the worn-out ideas and technologies from the West. Suffices to turn, at least for me, suffices to turn to literature that was produced by Sarajevans, about Sarajevo, to know that for a limited period of time, for the duration of reading, I too become a Sarajevan, sharing, at least in an abstract manner, sharing with the Sarajevans in their suffering, but also in their resistance to the unifying voice that forces us to speak with singular vocabulary. Sarajevans such as Abdullah Sidran, Miljan Kojergović, Dževat Karahasan, these are the writers whose works I continue feeding on, whose works I read, and whose works I'm familiar with, because in many ways they embody the Sarajevan altitude of existence, or the mosaic of ethnicities, confessions, and languages intimating and demonstrating the dubious benefits of living in various communities at once, emphasizing, as they do, the concentric circles of identity in which no one is at home in one identity alone. No one is flattened into one dimension alone. We all, to different degrees of emotional density and commitment, but we all partake in the variety of stock of meaning. And just as the Sarajevan literature, the Bosnian literature speaks in a number of voices simultaneously, reaching as it does into the Eastern Byzantine tradition, that is Eastern Orthodoxy, Eastern Christianity or Orthodoxy on the one hand, as well as Western Catholicism mixed with the homegrown autochthonous Islam. This is something that fascinated me when early in the 1980s I began traveling the land in which I was born. I didn't have to go as far as Istanbul to see the slender minarets and to observe the way they pierce the sky, opening up the temple for prayer, or forum for prayer. I am at home then in Sarajevo of the books as well. And all the while, when I am leafing through the number of books at my disposal, when I'm allowing myself to be seduced by the call of literature that invites me to contemplate, if not fully identify, with the totality of experience depicted, I maintain that infrequently voiced but always present gratitude and appreciation for the unsung ambassadors of the Republic of Letters. If what I've been describing with this imaginary map of the world is the map of the Republic of Letters, then we have to say that the Republic of Letters is the most democratic and the most all-inclusive republic there is. Nobody, the sole condition to become a citizen of this republic, whose borders are not written in any atlas, are constantly negotiated, but exist in the minds of all the readers. There is only one condition to enter, and that is the ability for empathy, but not the knowledge of the dominant or the major language, because what is important is that the Republic of Letters speaks not in the dominant language of the time, it speaks in translation. So the unsung ambassadors of the Republic of Letters are translators. Translators, those diligent workers in the trenches of literature, whose name often does not even appear on the front page of the book, will pick up. Translators are the true, as I said, ambassadors of the spirit of multitude and of the conditions for concentric circles of identity that enlarge the scope of our vision and that make our experience of daily life richer and more nuanced. If it were not for translators, then only a handful of us, those graced with the capacity to traverse between various languages with equal ease, we would be condemned to read only in the languages we know, and and nobody knows all the languages. So in that respect, we're all beholden to and should be grateful to translators. Translation, of course, is, as I said, the founding stone of the Republic of Letters, even though there have often been doubts that translation in a true, authentic sense is really possible. Of course, this is the pursuit of the unattainable, and I think that literature and translation, translation of literature both pursue this unattainable goal, the total reproduction of the text from one into another language. Here, of course, there are two different, shall we say, approaches, if not schools. And one is embodied in that famous dictum by Robert Frost, who had said that, famously said that poetry is what gets lost in translation. That is a sort of literary purism. It is the attitude that out of fear of a loss remains chaste, remains innocent, if you will, but ultimately it prevents us from appreciating the works in translation if poetry is what gets lost in translation. So how does one appreciate poetry? And why do I say poetry here and not literature? Because poetry to me is the quintessential expression of human experience, because it only calls for a limited number of words, and it condenses, like in a capsule, it condenses the totality of experience. So in that regard, it's very much like a poison. Poison is likewise sold in small doses. The good counter school to the Frostian dictum of impossibility of translation comes closer to home, comes from Turkey, comes from the Turkish literary canon, and particularly from Nazım Hikmet, a communist-inclined poet who had, I think, wisely and wittily come to appreciate the enormous effort of translators when he had said that reading poetry in translation is like kissing a bride with a veil. You still get to kiss her, even though it may not be the true thing. And in facing the choice between remaining chaste and virginal on the one hand, in the name of some unattainable purity of poetic translation, Frost, I opt for the Nazım Hikmet's attitude that allows for the irreducibility of poetry, allows for something that may be lost, but it pins its hopes on the capacity of poetry to push us away from, push us off the tracks, that punches us in the stomach, that turns the world upside down in a limited number of words. And if that means kissing through the veil, then I gladly go for kissing, even though there is a tiny veil between me and the bride. So in that regard, I think that translators are unsung ambassadors of the Republic of Letters, in which I happily dwell, because I believe that it not only enriches my inner life, but it reminds me of what is possible and of what could happen. Not what has happened, but what could happen. And in that respect, it constantly reminds me of the limitations of my own experience. It constantly reminds me of the limitations of the stock of meaning that comes from singular tradition alone, urging me to reach, to explore, to reach into the other stocks of meaning, to weave the variety of narratives into a portrait of a reader. And if a reader can in any way come close to what the city is, the city at its best, allows you to recognize all the other cities in it. Then the reader, the accomplished reader, allows himself, herself, to be many books at once. I know no other experience that would provide this sort of immediate, unmediated and indeed fecund, authentic experience with touching the other, with coming close to the other. I think that in our daily lives we tend to forget that language is more than just a means of communication, that language is in a particular way a way of, in a particular way a worldview, and sharing into a variety of worldviews inoculates you against falling for one only. And those that fall for one worldview only, those are easy fodder for the populist discourses that turn reasonable individuals into crazy mob. The scenes of which we had seen all too often in the 1990s, in a decade that should have been the best years of my life and the life of my generation, but had only brought carnage and destruction to the land in which we were born. So literature really offers a consolation as well. Not only does it provide view of the other, brings us close to the other, but it also comforts us and provides, as I said, a consolation for our own sufferings and for our own misgivings about what it means to be truly alive. To my mind, to a reader's mind, what it means to be truly alive is to be truly at home in a book. And I believe that I am truly at home in a book. I read, not in a book, I write. I think that we have all been first readers before we can become writers. But to be a good reader is something of an accomplishment. It's something of an infinite task that we need to practice time and again, or else our capacities for empathy can become rusty, and then we turn ourselves into, as I said, the recruits of an army that can march according to any given slogan, as long as it is only a singular slogan that infuses people with meaning, even though it floods the complexity of experience, reducing it to a sloganeering. And if we give up reading of literature that makes nothing happen, as Auden said about poetry, then a lot has happened. Because reading of literature that is something that is not immediately, that does not carry pragmatic consequences, that does not bring about pragmatic consequences, and it is not conditioned by the concrete necessity, but rather it is conditioned by the existential necessity, the necessity to see yourself from the perspective of the other by adopting the perspective of the other. If we, as I said, give up reading literature, then we have already given up our capacity to be informed and reasoned citizens, precondition for any democratic order. And it is in terms of literature as the forum for the totality of experience that continues to animate me, that continues to infuse my daily life with meaning, because I know that when I give up my commitment to the chronology of daily life, and when I let myself be invited and I respond positively to an invitation of literature that I likewise practice criticism of the purposeful rationality which drives and dominates contemporary capitalist societies, which means the entire planet, by withdrawing into the armchair, your preferred armchair, and by plunging into a book, one resists the purposeful use of time. One resists the rational guiding motif of the capitalist order, which is the maximization of profit. And what one does is the maximization of experience. And if literature continues to provide that, then I'm not afraid of the dwindling numbers of the readers and the increasing numbers of writers, because I believe that literature can provide us with an open window onto the land that no other artistic discipline can really assess and map as well as literature can. And that is the land of one's own mind. And maximization of experience, as I said, provided by literature is much preferable over maximization of profit, but not only because I'm pretty inept at maximizing the profit, but because I honestly and truly believe so. It is literature really that teaches us the similarity between the human mind and a parachute. Both can open only, excuse me, both can function only when they are open. And if this fragment of a lecture helped you in reviving, renewing your commitment to literature, then a lot has been accomplished, and I will gladly stop and open the floor for possible questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Debeljak. If there are questions, please stand up.
No, I'm sorry that I came a bit late. Sorry for that. And so I don't know exactly what you said in the beginning. But my question is because I only listened to you speaking beautifully about how you perceive cities through the literature, in fact, through writing and through the literature. And I would like to know from you how you, so to say, cope with really knowing the city. And then what happens if you also know the city? Therefore, not only in a mediated way.
I mean, what happens when you're familiar with the city through the books and when you actually have an experience of the city, of that same city? There's always a discrepancy between the two, and I think it's a productive discrepancy. Then you may begin to fault your own life for not matching the books, which is more often the case than the other way around. In other simpler terms, I found, odd as it sounds, but I find experience of reading about the city often more gratifying and more rewarding than my own walkings of the city. And that may render me as a lazy bum who prefers the armchair and the open book, but it may also speak something about the ability of literature to conjure up something more than meets the eye. And that, I think, is what is so terrific about literature, because it invites you to monitor and follow the very mind processes or the processes of creation where a variety of narratives come together. And that is not something that can easily be replicated by walking the streets of the city with a cigarette in one hand and a map in the other, or the iPhone in the other.
Thank you very much.
Alex, I know you came to Bucharest several times, and my question is whether you discover the city also through literature. If you have if you read some literature pieces about that, how do you find it?
Romanian literature has not been a terra incognita to me, but I have to say that I had read a number of poets that have touched upon the urban experience, though they have not necessarily focused on Bucharest alone. When it comes to Bucharest, then I will have to trust my feet and eyes more than I would trust the books, for a simple reason that I haven't read enough that there would be a stock of reading experience against which my experience of the glamour, the dust, and the charm of the Bucharestian streets will be gauged against. There's, what can I say, Ars longa vita brevis. There's a lot to be read still, and perhaps this, one of my many, as I said, visits to Bucharest will revive not only my walker's interest, but also my reader's interest.
Thank you so much for the conference. It was really much more than interesting. It was thrilling. You talked about the Slovenian writer who had a novel or something about a rural community, and your conference was about cities. Do you think that contemporary European literature can be or can treat rural communities, or if there are still rural communities there in Romania? I don't know in Europe if there are still. But literature can still deal with rural communities or destinies. I wonder. This is one question, and another, this is a little question. You've been talking from a very personal point of view. I think you used often the verb "I believe," and it is your own belief in literature. Literature is a kind of trading with fictional identities, in fact. But I'm wondering, and I ask you, if from a psychological point of view, is this a hope to view literature as a kind of trading with social identities, not only fictional identities? And your conference was also from a 20th century point of view, and we have crossed the border. We are in the 21st.
Obviously that we are deep, already deep in the 21st century, yet my formative years are in the past, and I cannot not deny them. I'm not saying that what I speak about is fashionable, but it is certainly existential experience, at least by me. And in that regard, I can very easily repeat, I believe in the emancipatory power of literature. I believe in the capacity for empathy as being the guiding motif in writing and reading literature. And when I say I believe, this is not another way of saying I maintain. It is truly I believe. It is credo qui absurdum est. It is I believe because it is absurd. And that gives me the sort of power to resist the more fashionable, more spectacular, more wide-reaching disciplines than literature. Literature, of course, has been, at least in the 20th century, the preserve of the minority. It has been so in the past, even more so. But even with the advancement of literacy, that is the ability to read, reading fiction and poetry has been preserved of a societal minority. And that minority happened to fashion itself as an elite minority. And in that regard, practicing what nobody else practices may be akin to an obsolete craft that is beautiful for its own shapes and not for the product it makes, so for its own integrity that comes from the commitment to the material and to the skills. And in that regard, I see literature, and I would be hard-pressed to accept the counter-thesis that the more you try to address the public in its own idiom, the more you try to come closer to the public, the more successful you will be, more people you will reach. If you want to reach more people, if you have a message to reach more people, then go to the first Wi-Fi spot and send a message. But literature begins where the message ends. And I think that that is the main distinction between other genres of writing and literature. In terms of rural and urban, obviously that is a divide that animates much of the modernity. But if you look at the map of Europe, you will see that, of course, cities are very salient points on the map. Yet they are embedded in the natural world. They are embedded in the forests. They are embedded in the streams and the brooks. They are embedded in the meadows and the marshes. So nature is really all around us. Yet we choose to have it only in the tame version, that is in the parks, in the urbanized or the cultivated nature, the man-made nature. Whereas nature with its primeval force, to my mind, and I come from the country that is more than 60% covered by forests, in that regard similar to Romania, I cannot deny the existence of the natural world. Moreover, what I'm looking into is the way that the rhythms of everyday life that have been articulated in the past, entirely rural, continue to survive under different guises in what we may call an urban experience. And it is at that intersection, at that sort of crevices and cracks between the natural and the urban world that the most productive way of looking at the world in totality may possibly occur. Otherwise, you know, and I know that books that simply go for the sort of immediacy of the urban experience often end up being indistinguishable from one another. But the ways the, shall I say, the peasant culture survives under the magnificent facades of the palaces and the stately buildings flanking the boulevards, that is specific, and that is particular. Otherwise, the experience of the city with all the plethora of the impulses and distractions tends to turn into a generic staple, something that only provides the information but does not grab you. At least that's my experience. And I gladly admit my bias. As I said, I have been socialized in the country that, and in the culture that is wedded to the natural world, does not want to divorce itself from the natural world. And in that regard, you may say that this is sort of a traditional experience, but if that is the case, then I happily accept and embrace the moniker of traditionalist. If that is a tradition, then I'm happy to be a traditionalist.